Lesson 7 for November 9 to 15, Our Forgiving God. Wednesday, November 13, The Law and the Prophets. Question. Read Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 23 to 31. How are the Israelites described in comparison to God's great goodness? As in verse 25. Nehemiah 9, beginning at verse 9. You also multiplied their children as the stars of heaven, and brought them into the land which you have told their fathers to go in and possess. So the people went in and possessed the land. You subdued before them the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, and gave them into their hands, with their kings and the people of the land, that they might do with them as they wished. And they took strong cities and a rich land, and possessed houses full of all goods, cisterns already dug, vineyards, olive groves, and fruit trees in abundance. So they ate and were filled and grew fat, and delighted themselves in your great goodness. Nevertheless, they were disobedient and rebelled against you, cast your law behind their backs, and killed your prophets who testified against them to turn them to yourself. And they worked great provocations. Therefore you delivered them into the hand of their enemies who oppressed them. And in the time of their trouble, when they cried to you, you heard from heaven, and according to your abundant mercies you gave them deliverers who saved them from the hand of their enemies. But after they had rest, they again did evil before you. Therefore you left them in the hand of their enemies, so that they had dominion over them. Yet when they returned and cried out to you, you heard them from heaven. And many times you delivered them according to your mercies, and testified against them, that you might bring them back to your law. Yet they acted proudly, and did not heed your commandments, but sinned against your judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. And they shrugged their shoulders, stiffened their necks, and would not hear. Yet for many years you had patience with them, and testified against them by your Spirit in your prophets, yet they would not listen. Therefore you gave them into the hand of the peoples of the lands. Nevertheless, in your great mercy, you did not utterly consume them, nor forsake them, for you are a God, gracious and merciful. This next section of the prayer sermon focused on life in Canaan as the Israelites possessed the land that God had given them. They had been handed land, cities, vineyards, and fields ready for use, but they had taken it all for granted. At the end of verse 25, we are told that they ate and were filled and grew fat. Growing fat is an expression that is found only a few times in the Bible. Deuteronomy 32:15 and Jeremiah 5:28, and each time it has a negative connotation. Let's look at those. Deuteronomy 32 verse 15, but Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, you grew thick, you are obese. Then he forsook God who made him, and scornfully esteemed the rock of his salvation. And Jeremiah 5:28, they have grown fat, they are sleek. Yes, they surpass the deeds of the wicked. They do not plead the cause of the fatherless. Yet they prosper, and the need of the needy they do not defend. The people might have delighted themselves in your great goodness, but theirs was a delight in all they had instead of a delight in God. Apparently, having everything doesn't produce a close walk with God. Many times we think, if only I had this or that, then I would be happy. Unfortunately, we see that the Israelites had everything from God, and yet their happiness in those things only made them less devoted to God. It's too easy for us to focus on the gifts while forgetting about the giver. This is a fatal deception. Of course, this doesn't mean that we cannot be happy for the things that God has given us. He desired that we rejoice in his gifts, but this joy in the things he gives doesn't guarantee a relationship with God. In fact, if we are not careful, these things can become a stumbling block. Nevertheless, in this chapter, the leaders now confessed the ways that they had been unfaithful to God. As they looked through their history, they specifically named transgressions they had committed as a nation. A couple of aspects emerge as especially important because they are repeated. 1. Israel cast God's law away, and 2. They persecuted the prophets. In other words, they realized that God's law and his prophets were essential to their development as a godly nation and as individuals. The prayer emphasizes this conclusion by stating that if a man does God's commandments, he shall live by them. Nehemiah 9 verse 29. That's a direct quote from Leviticus 18 verse 5, which reads, "You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. I am the Lord." And by highlighting that, it is the Spirit that spoke through the prophets. God has given us his commandments for an abundant life, and he sent his prophets to guide us in our understanding of his truth. What we do with these gifts is the essential question for us all. This week's lesson has been read by Dr. Percy Harold from Queensland, Australia. It is brought to you by Hope Channel, the Sabbath School Department, and through the services of Christian Services for the Blind. A video of this podcast also occurs on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.